phone calls started at 3 in the morning. First, it was my cousin Kevin, his voice shaking as he told me Jake had fallen out of his wheelchair and was bleeding from his head. Then Dr. Peterson called, saying the ambulance was on its way and that I needed to get to the hospital immediately. My mother was sobbing in the background, praying in Spanish, begging me to come home from my night shift at Mercy General. But I didn't rush home. I didn't even leave my station. Instead, I calmly finished giving medication to my patients, completed my charts, and told my supervisor I'd be taking my scheduled break, because 3 hours earlier, I had watched through our kitchen window as my supposedly catatonic brother Jake stood up from his wheelchair, stretched his arms above his head, and walked perfectly normal across our backyard to meet his girlfriend Tommy at the fence. For 3 years, I had bathed him, fed him, moved his limbs to prevent muscle atrophy, and slept on the couch next to his bed every single night. I had given up my nursing degree, my relationship with my fiancé David, and any chance of having my own life, all for a brother who could walk, talk, and apparently had been living a secret life behind our backs. So when everyone was calling me frantic about Jake's accident, I sat in the hospital break room and calmly ate my sandwich. After all, if Jake was healthy enough to sneak around our house and meet his girlfriend, he was healthy enough to explain to everyone how he really got hurt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whole nightmare started 3 years ago on a Tuesday night in October. I was in my final semester of nursing school at Riverside Community College, studying for my boards and dreaming about the pediatric nursing position. I'd already been offered at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Life was perfect. I was engaged to David, a respiratory therapist I'd met during clinical rotations. I had plans to move to a cute apartment in Pasadena after graduation, and I could finally see a future where I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, like my parents had their entire lives. That Tuesday, I was at David's apartment studying when my phone rang. It was my mother, and the sound that came through the speaker wasn't crying. It was something deeper, more primal, the kind of sound that comes from a mother's soul when it's been ripped apart. Jake had been drinking at a party near UC Riverside. On his way home, he'd run a red light and slammed into a minivan carrying the Torres family, a mother, father, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. Returning from the little girl's dance recital, Mr. Torres died on impact. Mrs. Torres spent 6 months in intensive care and would never walk again.
Ow.
Sophia, that beautiful little girl with pigtails and a pink tutu, suffered traumatic brain injury and would need care for the rest of her life. Jake survived with barely a scratch. The legal nightmare that followed destroyed our family financially. The Torres family sued for everything we had, which wasn't much to begin with. My parents had to take out a second mortgage on our small house in Riverside. Dad's construction company had to file for bankruptcy because all the equipment was seized as assets. Mom picked up a third job cleaning offices at night, on top of her day job housekeeping for wealthy families in Palm Springs. But the worst part wasn't the money, it was the shame. Our neighborhood in Riverside was tight-knit, mostly Latino families who had known each other for decades. Everyone knew what Jake had done. The story was in the local paper, the Spanish language. News everywhere. My mother couldn't go to the grocery store without people staring. Dad stopped going to church because he couldn't handle seeing the Torres family's extended relatives in the congregation. Jake spent 2 months in a medically induced coma after the accident. When he finally woke up, something was wrong. Opened his eyes, but he wouldn't respond to questions. He wouldn't move voluntarily, would stare straight ahead with this blank expression, like no one was home behind his eyes. The doctors called it catatonia, a psychological condition where the mind essentially shuts down to protect itself from trauma. Dr. Peterson, the neurologist at Riverside Medical Center, explained it to us in terms I could understand from my nursing classes. Sometimes when someone experiences severe psychological trauma, like causing the death of an innocent person, the brain essentially goes into protection mode. It shuts down higher functions to prevent the person from having to process the guilt, the shame, the horror of what they've done. The timing seemed to make sense. Jake had always been sensitive, even as a kid. He'd cry watching sad movies, couldn't handle seeing animals hurt, was the type of person who would rescue spiders instead of killing them. The weight of knowing he'd destroyed an entire family, that his choices had killed a father and changed that little girl's life forever, must have been too much for his mind to handle. So we brought him home, and I became his caregiver. At first, it was supposed to be temporary, just until we could get him into a long-term care facility or find a professional home health aide. But the insurance money from Jake's policy was tied up in legal proceedings, and we couldn't afford private care. The state programs had waiting lists that stretched for months. Someone had to take care of him, and since I was the one with medical training, the responsibility fell to me. I told myself it would just be for a semester. I'd defer my final term, take care of Jake until we figured out a long-term plan, then go back and finish my degree. David was supportive at first. He understood family obligations, and his own grandmother had needed care when he was younger. "Family comes first," he'd say, squeezing my hand. "I'll wait for you." One semester turned into a year. The insurance settlement finally came through. But most of it went to the Torres family, which was right, but it left us with just enough to cover Jake's basic medical needs. The state finally approved him for disability benefits. But the monthly check barely covered his medications and medical equipment. Every morning, I'd wake up at 5:30 and start Jake's routine. First, I'd check his position in bed to make sure he hadn't developed any pressure sores during the night. Then I'd help him sit up, which was like moving a rag doll. His body was completely limp, offering no resistance but no help either. I'd brush his teeth while he stared straight ahead, clean his face, check his catheter, and get him dressed. The physical therapy routine came next. Dr. Peterson had emphasized how important it was to move Jake's limbs regularly to prevent muscle atrophy and blood clots. So every morning I'd spend an hour carefully bending and straightening his arms and legs, rotating his shoulders and hips, massaging his muscles. It was exhausting work, and Jake would give no indication that he even knew what was happening. Feeding was its own challenge. Jake could swallow, but he wouldn't open his mouth voluntarily. I had to gently pry his lips apart and place small spoonfuls of food on his tongue, then massage his throat to encourage swallowing. Each meal took at least an hour. Breakfast was usually something soft, oatmeal or scrambled eggs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lunch might be soup or mashed vegetables. Dinner was often baby food, which was expensive but easier for him to swallow safely. The doctors said this was normal for catatonia. The body's basic functions continue, but voluntary movement and responsiveness essentially disappear. Some patients recovered in weeks or months. Others never came back. In the afternoons, when Jake was settled in his wheelchair in the living room, I'd try to study. I'd moved all my nursing textbooks into the living room so I could watch him, while reviewing material for the classes I'd eventually return to, but concentration was nearly impossible. Every few minutes I'd have to check on him, make sure he was breathing normally, adjust his position, clean up if he drooled. My professors were understanding at first. They'd give me extensions on assignments, let me take exams at alternative times. But nursing school isn't the kind of program where you can just dip in and out. The material builds on itself. Clinical rotations have strict attendance requirements, and patient safety depends on students being fully present and engaged. David started coming around less frequently. First, he'd visit every few days, bringing groceries, or just sitting with me while I did Jake's care routine. But watching me feed my brother baby food and change his catheter wasn't exactly romantic. Our conversations became strained. He'd tell me about his day at the hospital, the interesting cases he'd seen, the new respiratory therapy techniques he was learning. I'd tell him about Jake's bowel movements and whether he'd seemed more responsive during physical therapy. Breaking point came when I missed David's birthday dinner because Jake had developed what I thought might be pneumonia. His breathing had become labored, and he'd developed a fever. I spent the entire evening monitoring his vital signs and trying to reach Dr. Peterson. It turned out to be just a minor respiratory infection, easily treated with antibiotics, but I'd spent David's 26th birthday in our living room with a thermometer and stethoscope, instead of at the nice restaurant he'd made reservations for. "Emma, I love you, but I can't do this anymore," he said the next morning. standing in our kitchen while I prepared Jake's morning medications. You're not the same person I fell in love with. Become completely consumed by this situation. And there's no room left for us. I wanted to argue with him, to tell him that this was temporary, that things would get better once we found a long-term care solution for Jake. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had become completely consumed. I woke up thinking about Jake's care routine and went to sleep worrying about whether he was comfortable. I hadn't read a book for pleasure in months, hadn't gone to a movie, hadn't had a real conversation about anything other than medical symptoms and family obligations. I understand, I told David, not looking up from the pill organizer I was filling. I'm sorry. He kissed the top of my head, the same way he used to when we were happy, and left. I heard his car pull out of our driveway, and I knew I'd probably never see him again. The formal end of my nursing education came 6 months later. I'd been on academic probation for missing too many clinical hours, and despite my professors' best efforts to work with me, there was no way to make up the time I'd lost. The program director, Mrs. Chen, called me into her office on a Friday afternoon in spring. "Emma, you're one of the most naturally gifted students I've seen in 20 years of teaching," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your clinical evaluations were outstanding. Your academic performance was excellent. And you have the kind of compassion that makes for exceptional nurses. But you haven't been present for this program in over a year." I knew it was coming, but hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the stomach. "We're going to have to dismiss you from the program," she continued. "Your financial aid has been suspended, and you'll need to reapply if you want to continue your education in the future." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. The pediatric nursing position at Children's Hospital had already been filled. The apartment in Pasadena that David and I had put a deposit on had been rented to someone else. My entire future, everything I'd worked toward for 4 years, was gone. But Jake needed care, and I was the only one who could provide it. The routine that developed over the next 2 years was mind-numbing in its consistency. Wake up, Jake's. Morning care, physical therapy, feeding, afternoon care, dinner prep for the family. Jake's evening care, helping him into bed, sleeping on the couch nearby in case he needed anything during the night. Weekends were the same as weekdays. Holidays were the same as regular days. My world had shrunk to the confines of our small house and the occasional trips to Dr. Peterson's office for Jake's monthly checkups. My parents were grateful, but also guilty. They'd try to take over Jake's care on weekends so I could have a break, but they didn't have the medical knowledge to handle his more complex needs. Mom was terrified of moving him incorrectly and causing injury. Dad's back problems made lifting Jake from bed to wheelchair nearly impossible for him. So even on my supposed days off, I'd end up taking over when something went wrong. The isolation was the hardest part. My former classmates had graduated and started their careers. I'd see their Facebook posts about their first jobs as nurses, their new apartments, their relationships, and travels. Ashley Chen, who had been my closest friend in nursing school, tried to stay in touch at first. She'd call every few weeks to check on me, invite me out for coffee or dinner. But I could never leave Jake long enough for a real social outing, and our conversations inevitably centered on his condition and care needs. Eventually, Ashley's calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I didn't blame her. What did we have to talk about? Her life was moving forward, full of new experiences and challenges. Mine had become a repetitive cycle of medical tasks and family obligations. The financial strain was constant. Jake's disability payments covered his basic medical needs, but they didn't account for the hidden costs of home care. Special foods that were easier for him to swallow. Waterproof mattress protectors, medical supplies that weren't covered by insurance. Modifications to our bathroom to make his care easier, it all added up. My parents were already working multiple jobs to keep up with the mortgage and their own expenses. I couldn't ask them for money I knew they didn't have, so I started taking on small jobs I could do from home. Data entry work, online tutoring for nursing students, medical transcription, anything that would bring in a few $100s a month without requiring me to leave Jake. The work was tedious and poorly paid, but it helped cover some of our extra expenses, Dr. Peterson remained optimistic during our monthly visits. Catatonia can resolve spontaneously, he'd remind us. Sometimes patients just wake up one day and they're back to themselves. The important thing is to keep providing good, supportive care and wait for his mind to heal. But after 2 years of the same vacant stare, the same limp body, the same complete lack of response to any stimulation, I was beginning to lose hope. Maybe this was just Jake's life now. Maybe he'd never come back from whatever mental place he'd retreated to after the accident. And maybe this was my life now too. The spinster daughter who stayed home to care for her disabled brother while everyone else moved on with their lives. I tried not to be bitter about it. Jake hadn't chosen to be catatonic any more than I'd chosen to be his caregiver. We were both victims of that terrible night when he made the worst decision of his life. The difference was that his mind had found a way to escape the consequences, while mine was forced to live with them every single day. Some nights, after I'd gotten Jake settled and my parents had gone to bed, I'd sit on our back steps and allow myself to imagine what my life might have been like. I'd picture myself working in the pediatric ICU at Children's Hospital, using my skills to help sick kids get better. I'd imagine coming home to an apartment I shared with David, cooking dinner together while we talked about our days. I'd think about the kids we might have had, the trips we might have taken, the simple pleasure of sleeping through the night in my own bed without listening for signs that Jake needed help. But those thoughts were dangerous. They led to resentment, and resentment made the daily routine of Jake's care feel like torture instead of necessity. So I'd push those thoughts away and focus on the present. Jake needed me. My family needed me. This was my responsibility, and I was going to fulfill it with as much grace as I could manage. I just never imagined that the brother I'd sacrificed everything to care for was perfectly capable of taking care of himself. The first crack in my carefully constructed world appeared on a humid Thursday evening in August. I was in the kitchen, preparing Jake's dinner, blending carrots and chicken into the smooth consistency that had become second nature to me, when I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was Jake's voice, clear as day, coming from the living room where I'd left him in his wheelchair watching the evening news. "No way, that's incredible," he said, his voice animated and engaged in a way I hadn't heard in 3 years. I dropped the blender pitcher, and it shattered across our linoleum floor, but I barely noticed. My hands were shaking as I crept toward the living room doorway. Through the gap between the door and frame, I could see Jake sitting upright in his wheelchair. But something was different. His posture wasn't the usual slumped position I had to carefully arrange each morning. He was sitting naturally, leaning forward slightly, toward the television with genuine interest. On the screen, a news story was playing about a local teenager who had won a full scholarship to Stanford University, despite growing up in foster care. Jake was nodding along with the reporter's words, his facial expressions changing appropriately with the content. When the story showed the young man hugging his foster mother, Jake smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. I must have made a sound because Jake's head snapped toward the doorway. The moment he saw me, his entire demeanor changed instantly. The animation drained from his face like someone had flipped a switch, and he slumped back into the familiar vacant posture I knew so well. His eyes went blank, staring straight ahead as if I wasn't even there. My heart was pounding so hard, could hear it in my ears. I stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Had I imagined it? Was it possible for someone with catatonia to have moments of clarity that lasted only minutes? I walked slowly into the living room, watching Jake's face carefully for any sign of recognition or response. Nothing. He sat exactly as I'd positioned him an hour earlier, his hands resting limply in his lap, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the television screen. "Jake," I said softly, kneeling down beside his wheelchair. "Jake, can you hear me?" No response, not even a flicker of acknowledgement that I'd spoken. I spent the next hour researching catatonia online, looking for any medical literature that might explain what I'd witnessed. Could patients have brief periods of normal function? Or is it possible that Jake's condition was improving, that these moments of awareness might become more frequent? Dr. Peterson's office was closed, but I left a detailed voicemail describing what I thought I'd seen and asking for guidance. When he called back the next morning, his tone was cautiously optimistic. "What you're describing could indicate that Jake is beginning to emerge from his catatonic state," he explained. "Sometimes recovery happens gradually, with brief moments of normal function appearing before longer periods of awareness develop. It's actually a very positive sign." I wanted to believe him. Wanted to think that my brother was finally healing, that the 3 years of intensive care were about to pay off, but something about the interaction I'd witnessed felt wrong. The way Jake had immediately reverted to his catatonic state the moment he realized I was watching seemed too deliberate, too controlled. Over the next few weeks, I found myself watching Jake more carefully during the times when I thought he believed he was alone. I'd pretend to be busy in the kitchen while sneaking glances toward the living room. I'd step outside to check the mail but position myself where I could see through our front window. Most of the time, Jake remained in his usual unresponsive state, but occasionally I'd catch glimpses of something that didn't fit. Once, I saw him reaching toward the television remote that had fallen just out of his reach, his arm extended with purpose and coordination that shouldn't have been possible. When I rushed into the room, he was back to his usual position, but the remote was now within his grasp when it definitely hadn't been before. Another time, I returned from a quick trip to the grocery store to find Jake's wheelchair positioned differently than I'd left it. Not dramatically different, just turned a few degrees toward the window that faced our backyard. When I asked my mother if she'd moved him, she looked confused. "I haven't been in there all afternoon, Mia," she said. "Why?" "The most unsettling incident happened on a Sunday morning when my parents had gone to early mass. I was in the shower. Something I usually did quickly while Jake was safely positioned in his wheelchair in the living room. Our bathroom shared a wall with the living room, and through the thin walls of our old house, I could hear the television playing the Spanish-language church service that my mother always left on for background noise. But halfway through washing my hair, I heard the channel change. The familiar cadence of the priest's sermon was replaced by what sounded like a morning talk show, with upbeat music and multiple voices chattering in English. I stood under the spray of water, listening carefully, wondering if maybe the television signal had switched automatically or if there was some technical glitch. Then I heard laughter. Not from the television, but from our living room. Jake's laughter, genuine and spontaneous, responding to something the talk show hosts had said. I turned off the water so quickly that soap ran into my eyes, but I ignored the stinging, wrapping a towel around myself. I crept to the bathroom door and opened it slowly. The laughter had stopped, and I could hear the channel being changed back to the church service. By the time I made it to the living room, Jake was in his usual position, staring blankly ahead while the priest continued his sermon in Spanish. The television remote was in its usual spot on the coffee table, about 4 feet away from Jake's wheelchair. There was no way he could have reached it without getting up or moving his chair significantly. But there was also no other explanation for what I'd heard. That night, I called Ashley Chen for the first time in months. Despite the distance that had grown between us, she was still the closest thing I had to a best friend. And I desperately needed someone to talk to about what was happening. "Emma, it's so good to hear from you," Ashley said when she picked up. "How are you? How's Jake doing?" I found myself pouring out everything that had been happening over the past few weeks. The moments of apparent awareness, the small changes in his position or environment that couldn't be explained, the growing feeling that something wasn't right about Jake's condition. Ashley listened patiently, asking clarifying questions and offering the kind of medical insight I'd been craving. She'd graduated from our nursing program and was now working in the neurological intensive care unit at UCLA Medical Center. She'd seen patients with various forms of brain injury and psychological trauma. "What you're describing doesn't sound typical for catatonia," she said thoughtfully. "Usually when patients start to emerge from a catatonic state, the changes are more gradual and consistent. They don't typically have the kind of immediate, complete reversals you're talking about. So what do you think is going on?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear her answer. "I hate to say this, Emma, but have you considered the possibility that Jake might be exaggerating his symptoms?" The question hung in the air between us. I'd been thinking the same thing for days, but hearing someone else's voice it made it feel more real and more terrifying. "You mean faking?" I said quietly. I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening, Ashley said quickly. But malingering, where someone consciously or unconsciously exaggerates symptoms, does happen, especially in cases where there are significant secondary gains. Secondary gains. The phrase made my stomach turn. Jake received substantial disability payments each month. He had round-the-clock care from a family member with medical training. He had no responsibilities, no expectations, no consequences for the accident that had destroyed another family. If he was truly catatonic, those weren't gains, they were necessary supports. But if he was faking, Ashley, if someone was malingering, catatonia, how would you prove it? I asked. That's really difficult, she admitted. Catatonia is largely diagnosed based on observed symptoms and the absence of voluntary movement or communication. There's no definitive test that can prove someone is faking it. Usually, you'd need to catch them in moments when they think they're unobserved, showing normal function. After we hung up, I sat in my dark bedroom for hours, trying to decide what to do with my growing suspicions. If Jake was truly recovering from his catatonic state, then my vigilance and care had helped bring about a miracle. But if he was deceiving us, if he had been capable of normal function this entire time, the implications were staggering. I had given up my education, my career, my relationship. 3 years of my life to care for someone who might not have needed care at all. My parents had worked themselves to exhaustion, taken on crushing debt, destroyed their retirement savings for medical expenses that might have been unnecessary. We turned our home into a medical facility, restructured our entire family dynamic around Jake's supposed disability. And what about the Torres family? If Jake was mentally competent, then he was fully aware of what his actions had cost them. He was choosing every day to accept disability benefits and family support instead of taking responsibility for his choices. He was letting an 8-year-old girl and her mother struggle with their disabilities while he pretended to have his own. The thought made me physically sick. I started watching Jake more systematically after that conversation with Ashley. I began varying my routines, leaving the house at unexpected times, creating situations where Jake might think he was alone for extended periods. I positioned myself in places where I could observe him without being seen, using reflections in windows and gaps between doors to monitor his behavior. For several days, I saw nothing unusual. Jake maintained his catatonic presentation consistently, even during times when he had no reason to think anyone was watching. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the earlier incidents, if the stress of being his caregiver for so long had made me paranoid and suspicious. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, when my parents were both at work and I was supposed to be grocery shopping, I saw something that changed everything. I'd told Jake I was leaving to buy groceries and medication refills, making a show of gathering my purse and car keys. But instead of driving away, I parked around the corner and walked back to our house through our neighbor Mrs. Peterson's backyard. She was an elderly widow who spent most of her day tending to her garden. She'd given me permission months ago to cut through her property if I ever needed to check on something at home. I positioned myself behind the large avocado tree that grew near the fence between our properties, with a clear view through our kitchen window into the living room, where I'd left Jake in his wheelchair. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Jake sat motionless in his chair, staring ahead just as I'd left him. I was beginning to feel foolish for my elaborate surveillance when I saw a movement that made my breath catch. Jake's head turned, slowly toward the front door, as if he was listening for something. Then, apparently satisfied that I was truly gone, he reached down and unlocked the brake on his wheelchair. With smooth, coordinated movements, he wheeled himself to the kitchen. I watched in complete shock as my supposedly catatonic brother opened our refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of soda. Something I never gave him because carbonated beverages weren't safe for someone with swallowing difficulties. He opened it. Iceland took a long drink, his movements natural and purposeful. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was what happened next. Jake pulled his cell phone out from under his seat cushion. It's a cell phone I'd never seen before. It definitely didn't belong to our family. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear, and I could hear his voice clearly through our thin kitchen window. "Hey, it's me," he said, his voice strong and clear. "She just left for the store. You can come over now, but we don't have long." He listened to whoever was on the other end of the call, laughing at something they said. The sound of his laughter, so natural and unguarded, was like a knife in my chest. "I know, I'm tired of this too," he continued. "But we need to stick to the plan a little longer. The insurance money should clear next month, and then we can get out of here." "Insurance money? What insurance money?" "Jake's disability payments came monthly, and they went directly to his medical expenses." What other insurance money could he be referring to? "Don't worry about Emma," Jake said, and hearing my name made my hands clench into fists. "She's completely bought into the whole helpless, invalid thing. She has no idea. None of them do." He talked for several more minutes, making plans to meet someone that evening after our parents went to bed. He discussed logistics for moving money between accounts, mentioned something about plane tickets, and talked about getting rid of evidence before they left town. By the time Jake hung up the phone and wheeled himself back to the living room, I was shaking with rage and disbelief. I watched him carefully position his wheelchair in exactly the same spot I'd left it, lock the brake, and arrange his body. In the same slumped posture, he hid the phone back under his seat cushion and resumed the vacant stare that had defined my life for 3 years. I stayed hidden behind that tree for another 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd witnessed and decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm into the house immediately and confront him, to demand explanations and accountability for what he'd done to our family. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. If Jake had been deceiving us for 3 years, if he'd been planning some kind of escape with stolen money, then I needed more evidence than just my word against his. When I finally returned to the house with grocery bags as props, Jake was exactly as I'd left him. I went through the motions of his afternoon care routine, checking his position, offering him water, adjusting his blanket. All the while I was studying his face for any sign that he knew I'd discovered his secret. He gave nothing away. His performance was flawless, maintained even when I was close enough to touch him, even when I looked directly into his eyes, searching for recognition. If I hadn't seen him moving and talking with my own eyes, I never would have suspected anything was wrong. That evening, after our parents had gone to bed, I lay on the couch pretending to sleep while keeping one eye partially open to watch Jake. Around midnight, I heard the soft sound of his wheelchair brake being released. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, I watched him wheel himself quietly toward the back door. I waited until I heard the door close softly behind him, then I crept to the kitchen window. Jake was in our backyard, no longer in his wheelchair, but standing and walking normally across the grass toward the back fence. A young woman was waiting there for him, someone I didn't recognize but who was clearly expecting him. They embraced, and I realized this must be Tommy, the girlfriend he'd mentioned on the phone. She was petite, with long dark hair, probably around Jake's age, and from their body language, they were clearly in a romantic relationship. They talked quietly for several minutes, their heads close together in intimate conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Jake gesturing animatedly, using his hands expressively in a way that showed no signs of the motor difficulties that were supposed to accompany catatonia. At one point, Tommy handed him what looked like documents or papers which he reviewed carefully before nodding his approval. They were together for almost an hour before Jake walked back to the house. I rushed back to the couch and pretended to be asleep as he quietly maneuvered his wheelchair back into position and arranged himself in his usual catatonic pose. I lay awake for the rest of the night, my mind racing with questions and plans. How long had this been going on? Who was Tommy, and how had she become involved in Jake's deception? What was this insurance money he'd mentioned, and how was he planning to steal it? Most importantly, how was I going to prove what was happening and make sure Jake faced consequences for what he'd done to our family? The next morning, I went through Jake's care routine mechanically, my movements automatic after 3 years of practice. But inside, I was burning with anger and determination. My brother had stolen 3 years of my life, destroyed my future, manipulated our family's love and devotion for his own selfish purposes. But his deception was about to end. I was going to expose him, and I was going to make sure he faced Every consequence he'd been avoiding by hiding behind his fake disability. I just had to be smart about how I did it. The investigation I launched into my brother's deception consumed every moment when I wasn't actively providing his care. I became a detective in my own home, documenting evidence and building a case that would expose 3 years of calculated manipulation. But I knew I had to be careful. If Jake suspected I was onto him, he might disappear with whatever money he'd do. Been planning to steal, leaving our family with nothing but debt and destroyed trust. My first step was to figure out who Tommy really was and how she'd become involved in Jake's scheme. The next time I saw them meeting in our backyard, I took photos through the kitchen window using my phone's camera zoomed to maximum. The images were grainy in the dim lighting, but clear enough to show Jake standing normally and embracing a young woman who was definitely not a medical professional or family friend. I started paying attention to any unfamiliar cars parked on our street around the times when Jake typically had his secret meetings. There was a blue Honda Civic that appeared 3 times during the week I was watching, always parked 2 blocks away and always gone by morning. I memorized the license plate number and asked my cousin Kevin, who worked at the DMV, to help me trace it. "Emma, why do you need to know who owns this car?" Kevin asked when I called him with the plate number. "Is someone bothering you?" I couldn't tell him the truth about Jake yet. I needed more evidence before I could risk anyone in the family learning what I suspected. If I was wrong, if there was somehow a medical explanation for what I'd witnessed, I didn't want to destroy Jake's reputation and our family's hope for his recovery. "I think someone's been coming around the house when I'm not home," I said, which was technically true. "I just want to make sure our neighborhood is safe." The car was registered to Teresa Martinez, age 24, with an address in downtown Riverside, about 15 minutes from our house. Quick search on social media revealed that Teresa went by Tommy and worked as a server at a restaurant called Moonlight Diner. Her Facebook profile showed photos of her with friends at various local venues, but no pictures with Jake or any indication that she knew him. However, her Instagram account told a different story. Buried among photos of food and selfies were several images that made my blood run cold. There was a picture of expensive jewelry with the caption "Treating myself" posted just 2 weeks earlier. Another photo showed her holding a thick envelope of cash with heart tie emojis, posted the same day I'd received notification that Jake's monthly disability payment had been deposited. Most damning was a photo from 6 months ago showing Tommy wearing a volunteer badge from Riverside Medical Center. The caption read, "Giving back to the community," with a heart emoji. I recognized the badge because I'd seen similar ones worn by the volunteers who occasionally helped with patient activities in Dr. Peterson's neurology department. Everything started to make sense. Tommy had likely met Jake during one of his appointments or hospital stays. Maybe she'd been assigned to help with his care. Or maybe she'd simply seen an opportunity when she realized he was receiving substantial disability payments. Either way, she'd somehow become his accomplice in a scheme that had been going on for months, possibly years. But I still needed to understand what this insurance money was that Jake had mentioned on the phone. Our family's finances were already stretched thin, paying for his care, expenses not covered by his monthly disability checks. What other source of money could he be planning to steal? The answer came when I finally worked up the courage to search Jake's room thoroughly while he was at a doctor's appointment with my mother. I'd always respected his privacy before, only entering his room to provide care or clean. But now I methodically went through every drawer, every hiding spot, every possible place he might keep documents or evidence of his deception hidden inside. A hollowed-out textbook from his college days, I found a folder that contained the most shocking revelation yet. Jake had been receiving life insurance payments from a policy our grandmother had left him when she died 4 years ago. The policy had a disability clause that provided additional monthly payments if the beneficiary became unable to work due to injury or illness. The paperwork showed that Jake had been receiving these payments for the past 3 years, totaling over $40,000 annually, on top of his regular disability benefits. But according to the policy terms, the payments would stop immediately if Jake was found to be capable of working or if his disability status changed. There were also bank statements showing a savings account I'd never known existed. With a current balance of over $60,000 every month, money from both his disability payments and the insurance policy was being deposited and saved. While our family struggled to pay for his care expenses, and my parents worked multiple jobs to keep our household afloat, but the most devastating discovery was a handwritten letter from Jake to Tommy, apparently a draft that he'd never sent. In his own handwriting, he detailed their plan to disappear together once they'd accumulated enough money to start a new life somewhere else. He wrote about how easy it had been to fool everyone, how my nursing student background had actually made me more likely to believe his medical condition was real, and how he'd practiced the catatonic symptoms by researching the condition online. The letter also revealed the cruelest part of his deception. Jake wrote about how he'd chosen to fake catatonia specifically because he knew it would make our family feel sorry for him instead of angry about the accident. He'd calculated that psychological trauma would be more sympathetic than physical injuries, and that the guilt our family felt about the Torres family would make them more willing to sacrifice for his care. He'd been right. We'd all felt so terrible about what his accident had done to that innocent family that we'd channeled our guilt into devoted care for Jake. We'd told ourselves that caring for him was the least we could do, that his suffering was punishment. Enough for his terrible mistake. We'd never questioned whether his suffering was even real. Reading that letter, I finally understood that my brother wasn't the sensitive young man I'd thought I knew. He was a calculating manipulator who had destroyed our family's finances, my future, and our emotional well-being for his own selfish purposes. While the Torres family struggled with real disabilities and financial hardship from his drunk driving, Jake had been living a comfortable lie funded by insurance fraud and family sacrifice. I photographed every document in that folder with my phone, making sure to capture clear images that could serve as evidence. Then I carefully returned everything to its original position and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. That evening, I called Ashley again and told her everything I'd found. She listened in stunned silence as I described the insurance fraud, the secret bank account, and Jake's written confession of his deception. "Emma, what he's doing is criminal," Ashley said when I finished. "Insurance fraud, disability fraud, taking money under false pretenses, these are serious felonies. You need to report this to the authorities." "I know," I said, "but I want to confront him first. I want him to know that I know what he's done. I want to give him a chance to come clean to our family before I involve the police." "Be careful," Ashley warned. "If Jake has been lying about something this significant for 3 years, there's no telling how he might react when he's cornered. People who are desperate can be dangerous." Her warning proved to be prophetic. I decided to confront Jake on a Friday evening when my parents were both working late shifts. I waited until after their usual dinner time, when the house was quiet, and I could have Jake's full attention without interruption. I'd planned exactly what I was going to say, how I was going to present the evidence, and what I was going to demand from him. What I hadn't planned for was Jake's panic when he realized his deception had been discovered. I started by showing him the photos I'd taken of him walking in the backyard and meeting with Tommy. Jake maintained his catatonic facade initially, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't see the images on my phone screen. But I could see subtle changes in his breathing and posture that told me he was processing what I was showing him. "I know you can hear me, Jake," I said calmly. "I know you can see these pictures. I know about Tommy, about the insurance money. About the bank account you've been hiding from our family." Still no response, but I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "I found your letter," I continued. "The one where you wrote about how easy it was to fool me. How you researched catatonia online to learn how to fake the symptoms. I have photographs of everything, Jake. The bank statements, the insurance documents, all of it." That's when Jake's mask finally slipped. His head turned toward me slowly, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked directly into my eyes with full awareness and recognition. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the blank quality I was used to hearing during his rare moments of apparent response. This was Jake's real voice, clear and coherent and completely normal. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been faking this?" Jake looked down at his hands, which were now visibly shaking. "From the beginning," he admitted. "I was never really catatonic. When I woke up from the coma, I was fine. But I heard the doctors talking about the lawsuit, about how much money our family owed, about possible criminal charges for the accident. I panicked. The casual way he said it, as if 3 years of elaborate deception was understandable under the circumstances, made me angrier than I'd ever been in my life. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" I asked, my voice rising despite my intention to stay calm. "I gave up my nursing degree for you. I lost my relationship, my career, my entire future. Mom and Dad have been working themselves to death trying to pay for your care while you've been stealing insurance money and living a secret life with your girlfriend." "I never asked you to give up your degree," Jake said defensively. "Made that choice yourself." The audacity of his response left me speechless for a moment. Here was my brother, caught in the most elaborate lie imaginable, trying to shift blame onto me for the sacrifices I'd made to care for him. "You never asked because you were supposedly catatonic," I said through gritted teeth. "You manipulated our entire family into believing you needed round-the-clock care, and then you're going to blame me for providing it?" "Look, Emma, I know this looks bad," Jake said, finally dropping the pretense entirely and speaking to me like a normal person. "For the first time in 3 years, but you don't understand the pressure I was under. The Torres family was going to sue us for everything. There might have been criminal charges. I could have gone to prison, so instead you decided to commit insurance fraud and destroy our family's lives." "I was protecting our family," Jake insisted. "If I'd gone to prison, Mom and Dad would have lost the house anyway. This way at least I was bringing in money to help with expenses." "Money that you were stealing," I pointed out. "Money that was supposed to be for legitimate medical expenses. While our parents worked 3 jobs to pay for care you didn't actually need." Jake stood up from his wheelchair then, moving normally for the first time in my presence since the accident. The action was so jarring after 3 years of careful transfers and physical therapy that I instinctively stepped back. "What are you going to do?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that I didn't like. Gone was the defensive guilt, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "I'm going to give you one chance to come clean to Mom and Dad yourself," I said. "Tonight. When they get home from work, you're going to tell them everything. It's about the fake catatonia, about Tommy, about the insurance fraud, all of it. And if I don't, then I call the police and turn over all the evidence I've collected. You'll be charged with insurance fraud, disability fraud, and whatever other crimes you've committed. Tommy will probably be charged as an accomplice. And our parents will find out what kind of person their son really is when they see it on the evening news." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe he was considering confessing. Maybe some part of him felt guilty about what he'd done and was ready to take responsibility. But when he looked up at me, his expression was cold in a way I'd never seen before. "You always were self-righteous," he said, "acting like you're so much better than everyone else, like your sacrifices make you some kind of saint. You want to know the truth, Emma? I'm glad you gave up your nursing degree. You were never cut out for it anyway. You're too weak, too emotional. You would have failed eventually." His words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to stay focused on what needed to happen. "That's not going to work, Jake," I said. "You're not going to manipulate me with insults the way you've been manipulating this family with fake medical symptoms. You have until Mom and Dad get home to decide what you're going to tell them. What if I decide to tell them that their precious daughter has been making up crazy stories about me?" Jake said. "What if I tell them you've been under so much stress from my care that you're having paranoid delusions? Who do you think they'll believe? Their sick son or their daughter who's been acting increasingly unstable?" The threat was delivered, so calmly, so matter-of-factly that it took a moment for the full implication to sink in. Jake was prepared to gaslight our entire family, to make them think I was having a mental breakdown rather than confess to his deception. "I have evidence," I reminded him. "Photos, documents, witnesses who saw you walking around. You can't explain all of that away. Evidence that I'm getting better," Jake said with a shrug. "Evidence that I'm starting to have good days mixed in with bad days. Dr. Peterson will be thrilled to hear about my recovery. It's exactly what he's been hoping for." I realized then that Jake had thought through every possible scenario. probably long before I'd ever suspected his deception. He had contingency plans for getting caught, explanations that would allow him to maintain his fraud even after being exposed. The brother I thought I knew had never really existed. This calculating, manipulative person was who Jake had always been, and I'd been too naive to see it. "You're not going to get away with this," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "Watch me," Jake said. It's when I made the decision that changed everything. I turned toward his room, intending to retrieve the folder of evidence I'd discovered earlier. If Jake wasn't going to confess voluntarily, then I was going to present the physical proof to our parents the moment they got home. But Jake moved faster than I expected. As I headed down the hallway toward his bedroom, I heard him following. Behind me, when I reached for the door handle, his hand closed around my wrist. "You're not going to ruin this for me," he said, his grip tighter than it should have been possible for someone with the muscle weakness that was supposed to accompany long-term catatonia. I tried to pull away, but Jake's 3 years of secret normal activity meant he was much stronger than I'd expected. The careful physical therapy I'd been doing with him had been unnecessary. He'd been maintaining his muscle tone through his hidden activities. "Let go of me," I said, but Jake's grip only tightened. "You don't understand what you're messing with," he said. Tommy and I have been planning this for 2 years. We have everything set up to disappear next month. If you expose me now, you'll ruin everything." "Good," I said, trying again to pull free. "You deserve to have it ruined." That's when Jake lost control completely. Instead of letting go, he yanked me backward, away from his bedroom door. I stumbled, trying to regain my balance, but Jake's grip on my wrist threw off my center of gravity. We were standing at the top of the steep stairs that led down to our basement laundry room. The stairs were narrow and steep, installed when the house was built in the 1960s, with none of the safety features that modern building codes require. I'd always been careful on those stairs, especially when carrying laundry baskets that could block my view of the steps. When Jake pulled me backward, my foot caught on the edge of the top step. I had a moment of terrifying clarity where I realized I was going to fall, and that the concrete floor at the bottom of those stairs could seriously injure or kill me. But in that same moment of clarity, I also realized that Jake hadn't just pulled me backward accidentally. When I started to fall, instead of trying to catch me or steady me, he pushed. It wasn't a gentle push or an attempt to help me regain my balance. It was a deliberate, forceful shove that sent me tumbling down the entire flight of stairs. "God!" I fell, bouncing off the concrete steps and crashing into the basement wall. I could hear Jake above me making sounds of distress and calling my name as if he was witnessing an accident rather than causing one. The pain when I hit the basement floor was immediate and overwhelming. My left arm was bent at an angle that arms aren't supposed to bend, and there was warm blood running down my face from where my head had struck the concrete steps. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological impact of realizing that my brother had just tried to seriously hurt me to protect his secret. Jake appeared at the top of the stairs, back in his wheelchair, and calling down to me with apparent concern. "Emma? Oh my God, Emma. Are you okay?" "What happened, Mom?" "Dad, help." He was putting on a performance, pretending to be the disabled brother who had witnessed his sister's terrible accident. But I had seen his face in the moment when he pushed me, and I knew exactly what had happened. As I lay on that cold basement floor, bleeding and possibly seriously injured, listening to Jake call for help while maintaining his deception, I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. I was done protecting him. I was done being manipulated. And I was definitely done being the victim of his selfishness. When the paramedics arrived and asked what happened, I looked directly at Jake and said clearly, "My brother pushed me down the stairs." The look of shock and panic on Jake's face was worth every bit of pain I was feeling. For 3 years, he'd been in control of the narrative, manipulating our family's perception of reality to serve his own purposes. But now, injured and angry, and finally free of any obligation to protect him, I was going to tell the truth. All of it. The paramedics exchanged glances when I made my accusation. They could see Jake in his wheelchair, apparently unable to stand or move voluntarily. They clearly didn't understand how someone in his condition could have pushed anyone downstairs. "Ma'am, you may have hit your head pretty hard." Of them said gently. Sometimes after a fall, people can be confused about what happened. "I'm not confused," I said firmly. "My brother has been faking his catatonia for 3 years. He can walk, he can talk normally, and he just pushed me down these stairs because I discovered his fraud." By this time, my parents had arrived home to find paramedics in our house and their daughter being loaded onto a stretcher. The accusations I was making against Jake seemed impossible to them, especially seeing him in his wheelchair looking as helpless and confused as he had for the past 3 years. "Mia, you're hurt," my mother said, stroking my hair as the paramedics prepared to transport me to the hospital. "Don't worry about anything else right now. Just focus on getting better." But I wasn't going to let Jake escape consequences again by playing the victim. As they carried me up the basement stairs past where he sat in his wheelchair, I looked directly into his eyes. "I have photos of you walking around the backyard," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I have photos of your bank statements showing the insurance money you've been stealing. I have pictures of the letter you wrote to your girlfriend Tommy describing how you've been faking this whole thing." The paramedics and my parents looked confused, but I could see understanding beginning to dawn on Jake's face. I realized that I had evidence that would survive even if something happened to me, that his deception was going to be exposed whether he wanted it to be or not. "Emma, please," he said, and for the first time in 3 years. His voice carried real emotion instead of the flat effect he'd been performing. "Please don't do this. You should have thought about that before you pushed me down the stairs," I replied. At the hospital, while doctors x-rayed my arm and stitched up the gash on my forehead, I gave a detailed statement to the police about Jake's fraud and the assault. I provided them with my phone number so they could access the photos I'd taken of the evidence, and I gave them Tommy's name and address. The investigation that followed unraveled Jake's entire scheme within a matter of days. When police searched our house with a warrant, they found the folder of insurance documents and bank statements that I'd discovered. They arrested Tommy at her apartment and found additional evidence on her phone, including text messages between her and Jake discussing their plans to disappear with the stolen money. Jake maintained his catatonic act initially, even when police arrived to question him. But faced with overwhelming evidence and Tommy's eventual confession, in exchange for a reduced sentence, he finally dropped the pretense and admitted to everything. The legal consequences were severe. Jake was charged with insurance fraud, disability fraud, assault, and several other felonies. The insurance company demanded repayment of all the money he'd fraudulently received over 3 years, plus penalties and interest. Our family home was seized as collateral for the debt. My parents lost the retirement savings they'd never been able to rebuild after the original accident settlement. But the personal consequences were even worse. My parents had to face the reality that their son had manipulated and deceived them for 3 years, that the sacrifices they'd made for his care had been based on lies. They had to grapple with the knowledge that while they'd been working multiple jobs to support the family, Jake had been living comfortably on stolen money and planning to abandon them. Most painfully, they had to confront the fact that I had given up my education and my future for a brother who not only didn't need my care, but who was willing to physically hurt me to protect his deception. The revelation tore our family apart in ways that the original accident never had, at least when Jake was supposedly catatonic. We could tell ourselves we were doing the right thing by caring for him. But learning that our love and devotion had been exploited for selfish purposes destroyed the trust and unity that had held us together through other hardships. Jake was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he'd likely serve less with good behavior. Tommy received 18 months for her role as an accomplice. The Torres family, ironically, received some measure of justice when the insurance companies' investigation revealed additional assets that could be used to provide them with better long-term care. As for me, my broken arm healed, but the psychological wounds took much longer. I had to rebuild my sense of reality after 3 years of being systematically deceived by someone I loved and trusted. I had to process the anger I felt about the opportunities I'd lost and the future I'd given up for someone who hadn't deserved those sacrifices. But I also had to acknowledge that Jake's deception had revealed something important about my own character. When faced with the choice between exposing his crimes and protecting our family's reputation, I'd chosen truth over comfort. When he tried to silence me with violence, I'd refused to be intimidated. I'd spent 3 years thinking of myself as the self-sacrificing daughter who'd given up everything for family duty. But when it mattered most, I'd proven that I was strong enough to stand up for myself and demand justice, even when it was painful and complicated. With the insurance money recovered and the fraud charges resolved, I was finally able to return to school and finish my nursing degree. It took 2 additional years, and I had to take on significant student loan debt. Got it. But I graduated and found work in the pediatric intensive care unit at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, the same position I'd originally been offered for years. Earlier, my parents and I slowly rebuilt our relationship, though it was different now. We'd all learned hard lessons about the difference between supporting someone you love and enabling someone who's manipulating you. We'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's destructive choices. Jake and I haven't spoken since his sentencing. I don't know if we ever will. Part of me hopes that prison will give him the opportunity to honestly confront what he did and why he did it. But mostly, I've accepted that the brother I thought I knew never really existed. And I've stopped waiting for him to become someone worthy of the love and sacrifice I gave him. These days, when I care for children in the PICU who are truly struggling with serious medical conditions, I think about the difference between real suffering and performed suffering. I think about the families who would give anything to have their child recover the way Jake could have recovered at any time. And I'm grateful that I finally learned to recognize the difference between caring for someone who needs help and being manipulated by someone who's pretending to need help. The most important lesson I learned from those 3 years is that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's enabling. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your family is to stop participating in someone else's lies, even when telling the truth is painful and costly. Especially when telling the truth is painful and costly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.